We're back. I really need to know this opening because I know Kyoto Wind's opening. I'm not sure if I'm ready for more pain, but we're here. We're gonna live through it, I think. Let's go. I always start with this music, seriously. A cool breeze of night air brushed against my cheeks, and I gazed towards stars twinkling in the clear sky. Tonight, it seemed, was the final farewell between Hijikata-san and Okita. This was a moment I needed to let them have on their own. Being an outside observer to the intimacy of their conversation told me this much at least. My heart ached for them. Everyone left Edo for Kyoto only 4 years ago, tightly holding on to their hopes for the future. Huh? Wait! You! Wait! Yo! I know who this is! I did not expect this! What? Okay. In the middle of my contemplation, I thought I'd noticed Soma speaking to someone in distance. Oh, this makes more sense now! This makes sense! This... okay. He said he was planning to meet a friend in Edo, but... could this be the person whom he was talking about?
本当にいいのかお前副長とは知らない仲じゃないんだろせっかくだから挨拶ぐらいした方がいいんじゃないかいややめとくどうしてだ俺たちもう江戸には戻ってこられないかもしれないんだぞ近藤さんは新政府軍に捕まっちまったんだろそんな状況で土方さんにどんな言葉をかけたらいいかわからないしな。
Soma's head was suddenly hung low, as the words from his conversant seemed to resonate painfully. 言
葉じゃなくてもいいだろう。え？お前の思いを見てきたものを皆に伝えることができれば。それでいいじゃないか。相馬。
For a short while, Soma's acquaintance looked unsettled by the suggestion, staring at the ground uncomfortably. However, he exhaled deeply before speaking.
俺は新選組の大使だったわけじゃない。新選組ができた時。たまたまその場に居合わせただけだ。じゃあお前があの絵、羅刹になった芹沢さんの姿を描いたのはどうしてなんだ
Kamo Serizawa, chief of the Roshigumi who introduced the Water of Life to the group when they later became the Shinsengumi. He was assassinated by Hijikata for his unruly behavior upon the Aizu's command.
もう関係ない人たちだと思ってたら金にもならないのにあんな絵なんて描かないだろうそれはお前は今の土方さんや三男さん東堂さんたちに伝えたいことは本当に何もないのか
I heard him mention names of our warriors. Does this mean that this man was a friend of the Shinsengumi? Perhaps Soma was planning to meet him with the intention of bringing him over to our side? Whatever the case, Soma's acquaintance gave the impression that he was reluctant to be involved at all. I mean, I'm sure Soma knows what he's doing. So for now, perhaps it was best that this was something I didn't need to bring to Hijikata-san. As I began to process this information, Oh, okay. After hearing Hijikata-san's instructions, I walked back to the house from the darkness. This is gonna hurt. After Okita and I exchanged a few words. I thought they were gonna make me go through the pain, but this is still painful.
困らせたりはしてませんよ。あの先生が心配性なだけです。
相変わらず口が減らねえやつだ。まあいい。俺たちはそろそろ行くからな。
あれ？もう帰っちゃうんですか？
Yes, to me, Okita. Please take care of yourself. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to say that to leave.
千鶴ちゃん、ちょっと。
Never mind, we're gonna have pain. He beckoned me with a gentle gesture, so I walked up to him. Is something wrong?
土方さん、顔色悪いね。あんまり状況が良くないのかな。
No. If I spoke carelessly, I could possibly have given up too much information. Information that could easily hurt Okita, so I fell silent.
僕、あの人のことは全然好きじゃないし、はっきり言ってどうなってもいいけど、土方さんのそばにいてあげて。あの人が倒れたら、新選組は立ち行かなくなるから。
I understand.
話は終わったか。そんじゃ行くぞ。
Hijikata-san peered in, and I bowed to Okita before walking. Bye, Okita. Hijikata-san didn't ask a thing about what Okita and I talked about, and he began walking briskly ahead of me. Watching Hijikata-san made that promise to Okita a little earlier. The promise that he'd bring Kondo-san next time. It seemed as though the burden of that promise and the potential it'd be unfulfilled weighed heavily on him. Suddenly, Hijikata-san halted in his tracks. What do you mean? What do you plan on doing, Hijikata-san? You're going now? I thought we did everything that we could already. But it's not safe for you to be in Edo for longer than you need to. The Imperial Army has been after us. They could turn up at any moment. If you get arrested, just like Kondo-san was, then... Yesterday, Hijikata-san seemed caught up in his dejection. So much so that such a proposal was beyond expectation. Why? Why would he be acting like this all of a sudden? Well, I'm not saying that. Hijikata's veins were beginning to show in his face. I told him, "Stay strong" is the correct one, yep. Please, Hijikata-san, I beg you, stay strong. You of all people should know what needs to be done at that moment. I was surprised to hear myself raise my voice towards him. I understand, but what are you going to do if you're arrested by the Imperial Army?
何もできねえで終わっちまうぞ。
So you're going to let Inoue and Yamazaki's sacrifices go in vain?
お前に何がわかる。
Hijikata-san exploded, and even though it frightened me, I had to give my peace. Even I understand a little! I refused to let my convictions amount to nothing. My heart felt so heavy. It was even painful to speak. Tears began to well up in my eyes. I couldn't help it. I was there. I saw what Inoue and Yamazaki gave their lives for. I saw it with my own eyes. Both of them loved the Shinsengumi more than anything, and they trusted their commander! If either of them were witnessing what I am right now, it would crush them.
悲しむ
At last, he seemed to let go of the tension, and his shoulders relaxed slightly as he looked into the distance.
残されたやつは先に行ったやつらの意志を継ぐべきだと。
Well, I think so. I mean, I felt like I was doing so in that very moment. The reason I couldn't back down, even if Ichikata-san felt compelled to yell at me, was because I knew Inoue-san and Yamazaki-san would have done the same.
じゃあ俺の死ぬまで荷物は増えるばかりじゃねえか。
Ichikata-san.
怒鳴っちまって悪かったな。確かにお前は分かってた。
His smile looked melancholic. I need water. I can't speak! It still tastes like strawberry tea! This is like the 5th refill or something! Jesus Christ! Strawberry tea is strong! His smile looked melancholic, and I felt a dull pain in my heart.
不利な状況で俺が焼けっぱちになるわけにはいかん。大将が戻ってきた時、居場所がなくなってたんじゃ笑い話にもならねえ。
I realized that Hichikata-san had finally regained his composure, and I responded in kind by calming down. Hijikata-san, I know I told you to stay strong, but at the same time, please don't push yourself too hard. I noticed you've been running around during both daytime and nighttime.
人のことを気にしてる余裕なんてあんのか。江戸を出た後、途中で倒れたら容赦なく置いていくからな。覚悟しとけ。
Boy! I was happy that I got through to him, even if it was just a courteous gesture. I ran right behind him, doing my best to keep up in the swiftness of his pace. Man is very tall. Chizuru is very short. Legs, major difference, so major differences in stride. After leaving Okita, we had finally met up with Soma and Shimada, who were looking for us outside. Just then... shit. Soma looked frigid as he approached Hijikata-san nervously.
俺に局長と野村の除名嘆願をさせてください。幕府側も局長をこのまま死なせたくはないはずです。協力してくれる人もたくさんいると思います。ですからどうか。
Hijikata-san was staring down at Soma, whose head was bowed deeply out of respect, and he seemed to take Soma's suggestion into consideration.
言おうと思ってたことを先に言われちまったな。
副長、それでは。
島田、頼みがある。雪村を連れて先に江戸を出てくれ。
What?
俺たちは近藤さんの除名嘆願を続ける。お前の存在はもう足手まといにしかならん。
Hijikata-san had given me the same instructions earlier, albeit with a far more aggressive tone. But this time, I could sense that Hijikata-san came to this conclusion after thoughtful consideration. I was so worried about him, of course, but there was nothing more I can argue.
これは副長命令だ。俺もすぐに後を追うからもうしばらく待ってろ。
I could see Shimada biting his tongue, almost like he was swallowing his displeasure.
わかりました、副長。
He nodded firmly, then Hijikata-san looked towards me. There was nothing I could do aside from follow the orders given to me. Understood. Hijikata-san and Soma turned around, heading towards the direction from which we were just running. It was so like Hijikata-san to bear the burdens of many under his command. However, as I watched him saunter into the distance, I couldn't help but feel like this was the last time we would see each other. Suddenly, my heart sank. Please be safe, Hijikata-san. Holding these tender wishes close to heart, Shimada and I escaped Edo together. We met up with the other shogunate troops sometime later in Ichikawa, and as remnants of the old feudal government, we decided to head to Nikko. Saito had been in Ichikawa for a while, but he left earlier for Aizu to oversee the Fury Corps. I worried about what would happen to Kondo-san. But perhaps because the situation seemed grim, none of us ever brought it up. Ooh, we get this one. Oh god. Hijikata-san took the first opportunity he could to begin visiting vessels to request urgent clemency for Kondo-san. He was busy day and night, hardly sleeping. In the end, though, the former vessels were wary of upsetting the Imperial Army, and they refused or outright ignored Hijikata-san's pleas. What made matters worse was Soma's own petition for clemency resulted in his arrest. Oh shit! On April 11th, the head of the Satsuma domain met with an ambassador from the shogunate. As a result of these negotiations, Edo Castle was surrendered to the Imperial Army. But the war was not over. We'd left Edo in advance of the negotiations to meet up with the Denshu Company. Someone's arrested, what the fuck? Hijikata-san returned from his other engagements as we joined with the... Hijikata-san returned from his other engagements as we joined with the Denshu Company, and together we headed north. Saito had taken the main body of the Shinsengumi ahead to Aizu in order to keep an eye on the Fury Corps. We left Ishikawa and set off down the Nikko route to Aizu. We finally managed to meet up with some allied soldiers, but many of them looked at us with a strange mixture of curiosity and fear. It was unpleasant.
あいつらが人斬り新選組か。
ああ、気に入らなきゃ仲間さえ切り殺す狂犬の集まりって噂だ。目を合わせない方がいいぜ。どんな難癖つけられるか分かったもんじゃねえ。
It wasn't difficult to hear the gossip about us that had begun to travel the ranks.
口差がない連中ですね。黙らせてきましょうか。
やめておけ。言いたいやつには言わせときゃいい。
You sounded even more irritated than usual. Hijikata-san, are you alright? You don't look too well.
大したことはねえ。
You certainly didn't look it. His skin was a pale color, almost blue, and he looked as if he might collapse any moment. Marching during the day was hardly pleasant for a Fury. Kondo-san was clearly at the forefront of his mind. I had to admit, he did have good reason to be on edge.
あっと、あそこ通してくれる？悪いね。よっ、あっと。
Someone was moving towards us from the back of the column, pushing his way through the rest of the marching soldiers.
はじめまして。君が土方くんかい？君たち新選組の名前は僕たちの間でも随分鳴り響いているよ。
なんだ、あんた。
ああ、自己紹介がまだだったね。僕は歩兵奉行の大鳥圭介、伝習隊の指揮を任されている。
Army Minister, an elected command position that presides over the Republic of Ezo's infantry force. So he's an infantry magistrate.
新選組の皆さんには今後いろいろと世話になると思う。よろしく頼むよ。
He gave a friendly laugh and extended his right hand. It was peculiar, though. For a man who claimed to command the infantry, he looked more like the son of a wealthy merchant than a soldier. Hijikata stared down at the hand as if it were a week-old fish. A week-old fish?
まあ、手袋を外すのを忘れていたな。
He hurriedly plucked the glove off his right hand and then thrust it toward Hijikata-san again.
金でも恵んでくれってのか。
シェイクハンドだよ。知らないのかい？欧米での挨拶のようなものだよ。
Hijikata-san snorted under his breath and turned away. Otori left his hand out for a few moments longer before pulling his glove back on silently.
大鳥さん、副長に何かお話があったんじゃないですか。
ああ、ぜひ新選組の副長から直々に今日での特に鳥羽伏見の話を聞かせてもらいたいと思ってね。
That's interesting, but why?
俺から聞くより尾ひれのついた噂でも追っかけた方が楽しいんじゃねえか。おしゃべりな連中が多いみてえだしな。
いや、これは申し訳ない。軍備は整えたんだが、軍機の方はまだ末端の兵にまで行き届いていなくて。とりあえず、この軍の編成について説明しよう。旧幕府軍脱走隊の約3000人が先方中軍後軍に分かれている。僕はその総督を任されているんだが。
総督？つまりあんたが総大将ってこと？
一応そういうことになるね。
Hijikata-san looked as if he just swallowed something rotten. Oh god. He only just lost his chief, and now Otori was trying to force himself into Kondo-san's place. No one, no matter how skilled, could replace his friend. Still, Otori seemed to have expected to be rebuffed, and continued, showing no sign of being put off by Hijikata-san's behavior.
先方は桑名藩会津藩を主体とした部隊、そして中軍は僕たち伝習隊を主体としている。後軍は旧幕府回転隊が中心だ。僕はこの先鋒軍の参謀に土方君を推薦しようと思っている。どうですか？
Deputy Commander, a secondary position to a military troops commander. Hijikata-san served this role in the Denshu Company, as did Ito for the Shinsengumi.
どうして俺なんだ？
僕は実戦経験があまりないから優れた先達に従おうかと思ってね。それに新選組の土方君の名前は敵にも味方にも知らないものはない。先鋒軍にはうってつけの指揮官だ。
Otori's copious praise did nothing to thaw Hijikata-san. They just stared at one another for a few awkward moments. It was painfully obvious. Oh my god, the tha's there. It was painfully obvious that the two of them didn't see eye to eye, and it could not have been a worse first impression.
では、僕はこれで失礼するよ。詳しい作戦についてはまた後日話し合うことにしよう。
Their conversation ended as one-sided as it had begun, and Otori disappeared into the swarm of marching soldiers. That was something. Fire. Later that night, we camped a short distance away from the rest of the force.
おい、島田、雪村、話が。こっちへ来い。
The main bulk of the Shinsengumi, as well as the Fury Corps, were headed to Aizu under Saito's command. That meant that the only people in camp were myself, Shimada, Hijikata, and about 10 other Shinsengumi.
お前たち、さっきあの歩兵奉行さんとやらが言ってたこと覚えてるか？
副長が先鋒軍の指揮を取るということですよね。
そうだ。で、お前たちの身の振り方だが、お前たちは先鋒軍に入れねえ。中軍、後軍に編入させるつもりだ。
それはどういうことでしょう？副長が指揮するのは先鋒軍なのですよね。
お前は鳥羽伏見の戦を経験してるんだ。実戦経験のねえ部隊を指揮するにはもってこいの人選だろう。
しかし
Hijikata-san's reasoning made sense, of course. But as an outside observer, it felt like Shimada had grown attached to the idea of fighting in the same unit as Hijikata-san. Perhaps Hijikata-san was insensitive for either ignoring this sentiment or not acknowledging it at all. Shimada-san sighed heavily, resigning into a period of deep thought, but then he looked Hijikata-san in the eye.
わかりました。副長の命令であれば従います。ですけど、一つ確認させてください。新選組がなくなってしまうわけではありませんよね。俺は新選組の島田会としてこの戦に参加するつもりです。誠の大旗を掲げます。
Aww. Makoto flag. A kanji character used to mean integrity, which is used by the Shinsengumi as a symbol on their flag to define their core tenet.
それで構いませんよね。
Shimada and I felt the same way, it seemed. Hijikata-san's hope may be flickering, but ours wasn't.
好きにしろ。
Hijikata-san seemed so disengaged.
それからもう一つ、部隊の指揮は雪村君には荷が重すぎると思います。
Thanks, Shimada. But yes, technically.
どう考えても前線に出られるとは思えませんし、彼女は大使ではなく副長の故障という立場ですから。では俺は他の大使たちに決定を伝えに行ってきます。
With that, he turned and jogged off towards the rest of the Shinsengumi soldiers. Bleh. Hijikata and I were left alone. He sighed and his shoulders drooped. Suddenly, he looked very, very tired. Why did you try to order us away? He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head back to gaze up at the stars that speckled the night sky. The long, melancholy silence spoke volumes, but as I began to regret questioning his decision, he spoke up. Maybe I shouldn't have said anything at all. Was I putting pressure on his fragile emotional state, or was it a truth I needed him to answer?
近藤さんがいつ戻ってくるのかさえ分かりゃ死ぬ気で戦いもするさ。だが今度ばかりはどうなるか分からねえときてやがる。俺たちは今まで二人で新選組を背負ってたんだ。俺一人で支えきれるわけねえだ。
Ichikata-san was often rude or cruel when he spoke to me, but I never heard him sound so defeated before. And he had never talked that way about the Shinsengumi. His shoulders sagged. Oh my god. Although his voice sounded completely devoid of energy, he continued. My phone! Oh shit. I'm sorry, there was a phone call. I did it. We're fine now. え？
甲府城に行くって決まった時、あいつと原田が言ってたろ。かつ阿波の神が軍資金や大砲を気前よく出してくれるはずがねえ。何か裏があるんじゃねえかって。その通りだったよ。新政府軍に江戸城を明け渡すって決めたのはその勝阿波の神だったらしい。
Huh. What? Then that meant the battle in Kofu had been...
新政府と穏便に話を進めてえのに、俺たちみてえなのがいちゃ邪魔だから手よく追っ払われたってことだ。
He gave a dry laugh and kicked despondently at a rock near his foot.
くそ、どうして気づかなかったんだよ。近藤さんに戦の指揮を取らせてやりてえ、戦場に立たせてやりてえって気持ちに目がくらんじまった。それが負け戦になっちまって、近藤さんのやる気をなくさせちゃう。何の意味もねえじゃねえかよ。
I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. The Shinsengumi had put their lives on the line for the shogunate. The shogun should have come to their aid. Instead, the Shinsengumi was abandoned, and because of that, we lost Kondo-san.
おまけに必死こいで剣術の稽古して、ようやく刀をさせるようになったってのに、鉄砲相手じゃ手も足も出ねえときた。 武士ってのは戦が専門じゃねえのか。俺たちが信じて追いかけてきたものって一体何だったんだ。その先に何かがあるって信じてたからこそ、きつい思いしてみっともなく歯食いしばって坂を登ってきたんだぜ。登った先に何もねえって分かっちまったら、これからどうすりゃいいんだよ。俺は 信じて生きていきゃいいんだ。
With every word he spoke, I could feel his pain. It had been Hijikata-san and Kondo-san's partnership that had allowed the Shinsengumi to flourish. But the shogunate had betrayed them. War changed, and now he felt the world moving on without him. All that Hijikata-san had done was fading away, and the pain of that loss was destroying him. What could I say to help lessen that pain? I believe in you. I think you feel this way because you have lost what you believed in. But the men out there, the few that are left, I think what they believe in is you. They think that as long as you're there to lead them, they'll be fine, and they refuse to show fear in front of you. They want you to see the kind of men they are, which means they'll fight to the death if you tell them to. I didn't know what else I could say to make him feel better, but I wanted to soothe his wounded soul at least a little. As much as I could, I said what I felt. To be honest, I don't really know much about things like the reason the Shinsengumi exists, or what you should believe in. But if somebody asked me why I was here, I think I'd say that it's because I believe in you, Hijikata-san. So, maybe that had been the wrong thing to say. He was worried about what he believed in, not me. All I done was probably give him yet another thing to worry about. More pressure. Hijikata-san turned to look at me, but for once, the light in his eyes was soft.
見失っちまったものってのはてめえでもう一度見つけなきゃどうしようもねえよな。それに今はでかい戦が控えてる。あれこれ悩むくらいなら勝つことを考えねえとな。
With a small, crooked smile, he turned back to the stars. Perhaps my words had been a little too harsh. I fell silent again. The only sounds were nearby bugs chirping and fluttering in the night. I was worried saying anything would just make things worse.
本当にここにいるつもりか。
I knew he wanted to go alone, but I couldn't go with Shimada, and we both knew it. Hijikata-san's eyes thinned, and he pondered for a moment as I stared idly to the side. Yes, I am. Perhaps I didn't know how I could help him just yet, but I could hardly leave him alone. I know. We stood there in the silence of the night. Just then, let's welcome round 3. He moaned suddenly and bent over in pain. Hijikata-san! In a matter of seconds, his hair began to turn white. Let's go over here. I led him to the shadow of a large tree, where the nearby soldiers wouldn't be able to see him. You know exactly why. He spoke through gritted teeth, and as I watched, his breath became desperate gasps. Frustration fought with pain for dominance of his face as the bloodlust began to take hold. I decided to... I'll give him blood. Hijikata-san. I ran towards him, pulling at my collar to loosen it. He grasped my intent and grimaced. He took hold of me and pulled me roughly towards him. I felt a dull sting on the back of my neck, and then the hot trickle of blood. Then I felt his lips. The quiet sound of his drinking filled my ears in the silence of the night. His warm breath came in pants across the back of my neck, but after a time, I felt it began to steady. Slowly, his grip loosened. I could sense the pain leaving his body. Then, without a word, he pulled away from me. What? When he looked at me, I saw worry in his eyes. I smiled back. Forever. As long as you need me, I'll be here. It's all right, really. I want to do this. There was nothing for him to say to that. We were on our way to Nico when the news came to us. Is this what I think it is? We were only a short distance away in a nearby forest. Hijikata-san and Otori stopped to talk over their next move after the scouts had brought news of Utsunomiya's fall.
抑えられたって言っても単に錦の旗にビビって標準した口だろう。奴ら以上の力を見せつけてやりゃすぐこっちに尻尾振ってくるさ。節操のねえ連中だからな。新政府軍に寝返った奴らの城なんざ落としちまって構わねえだろう。歩兵奉行さんよ。
僕は別に戦うことに反対しているわけじゃない。ただ大山で戦っていた中軍皇軍はまだ合流しきれていない。彼らが追いつくまで待ってくれと言ってるんだ。
Oyama, an in-town located in Nikko-Kaido. Currently, it is known as Oyama City in the Tochigi Prefecture. I need water. Woo! I read it better.
城を落とすというのは戦略的に愚の愚とされている。今は
そりゃどこのありがてえ蒼天の孫引きだ。お得意の西洋法術か。
Drill manual, a guide that provides in-depth instructions on practical infantry procedures. Pamphlet, a printed work copied on parchment, serving as a form of mass disseminated text. What?
これは西洋だけの常識ではない。孫子の兵法にだって同じことが書かれている。
The Art of War, an ancient Chinese military treatise? Written by ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu.
城兵は棒を打ち、その次は甲を打ち、その次は兵を打ち、その下は城を攻む。つまりやむを得ない時を除いて城を攻めるというのは愚かだと説いているんだよ。愚を犯すのであれば、せめて自軍を最良の状態にして確実な勝利を目指さなくては。
Hijikata-san cut Otori off and gave him a rebuttal.
兵は拙速を聞くも、未だこれを巧みにして久しくするを見ざるなり。戦ってのは時間をかけてうまくやるより、多少下手でも素早くやれってことだ。これも孫子の兵法に書かれてる言葉だぜ。
Damn.
土方君、話を混ぜ返さないでくれ。中軍皇軍が我々に追いつくのに何十日もかかるわけじゃない。あと少しだけ待ってくれと。
のんびり高速部隊を待ってるうちに敵の援軍が来ちまったらどうするんだ。あの射程の長い化け物銃を持った薩長の連中がやってきやがったら勝てる見込みはなくなっちまうぜ。
For the first time, Otori didn't have a rebuttal ready. Hijikata-san must have sensed that he struck a nerve, and he pushed ahead.
気を逃すくらいなら俺が先鋒軍だけで城を落としてやるさ。
それは危険だ。そんなのは戦争ではない。ただの自滅だ。
His voice rose in shock, but Hijikata-san just snorted derisively. He clearly had no intention of taking his opinion.
まあ黙って見てろよ。日が暮れるまでには宇都宮城を落としてやるさ。
His lips pulled back from his teeth in a feral grin, and he looked off towards Utsunomiya. He wasn't being belligerent. I think reckless was more of an accurate term. With Hijikata-san like this, could we really win? I couldn't wipe the fear in my heart. April 19th, 1868. Otsunomiya Castle was in turmoil. Our forces numbered around 2,000, while the castle had barely 700 guardsmen. The battle for Shimogawara Gate was especially intense, with 1,000 shogunate troops against only 400 guards. Although the shogunate soldiers easily outnumbered their opponents, the guards were able to use the fortifications to great effect, fighting the invaders to a standstill. Guns cracked and bullets flew across the battlefield as the men screamed in pain. Hijikata-san turned to face the 200 men now under his direct command.
このままじゃキリがねえな。そろそろ敵陣に突っ込んでもいい頃か。
敵陣に？何を言ってるんですか？向こうは銃を持ってるんですよ。
奴らが持ってるのは薩長が使ってる新型の銃とは違う。少し離れるよ。当たらねえし命中精度も低い。
Damn.
それに弾の1発や2発当たったところですぐ死ぬわけじゃねえさ。
そんな無茶な。
The men were stunned. Never would they have imagined that they might be given orders like these. Hijikata-san, on the other hand, stared back at them coldly.
お前ら、ここに何しに来た？戦しに来たんだ。だったら死ぬ覚悟ぐらい持ち合わせてるはずじゃねえか。合図をしたらそこのやつから前に進め。
He pointed toward the source of the bullets raining upon the battlefield. Hijikata-san's men turned pale, and many of them trembled. Eventually, one of them snapped. He broke and turned to run. No sooner than when the soldier ran for it, Hijikata-san's sword leapt from its scabbard and sliced across the back of the fleeing man. He fell to the ground, dead. The men watching swallowed. For a few short moments, they were utterly silent. The commotion broke out shortly afterwards.
おい、味方を切りやがったぜ。
どういうことだ？頭がいかれてやがるのか。
Hijikata let his cold eyes slide slowly across their ranks, and slowly the mumbling ceased.
他にも敵前逃亡してる奴はいるか？怖かったら逃げてもいいんだ。ただし、逃げようとした奴は片っ端からこの刀で切り捨ててる。俺に切り殺されるか、それとも銃弾の雨の中を突っ切っていくか、好きな方を選べ。
His eyes were cold and dead. He was serious. Not a man there believed for a moment that he wouldn't kill them without a second thought. With one final scowl, Hijikata-san turned back to the battlefield and took off across it. He ran through the hail of bullets and fell upon the men defending the gate like a vengeful god. His beloved sword, the Izumi no Kami Kanasera, dripped with flesh blood. But he swung it again and again, oblivious and uncaring. I desperately hid in the shadows, making sure the bullets didn't hit me as I waited for Hijikata-san.
副長、あと少しで城門を崩せそうです。
I don't think I've ever seen Shimada with his sword out. Shimada's face was smeared with dirt and blood as he ran up towards the commander.
Oh, 頼りにしてるぜ、島田!
The guards fired desperately, but as Hijikata-san had said, their guns were old and inaccurate. Attacking men with guns head on was frightening, but Hijikata-san seemed to be utterly unconcerned. He dodged and wove through them, his sword ending lives with each stroke. Considering that the battle was taking place during the middle of the day, he shouldn't even be standing. However, his determination and savagery gave no such indications of distress.
あの人は本当に人間なのか。地獄から這い上がってきた鬼なんじゃねえのか。
The mood among the men watching Hijikata-san fight began to change. None of them had likely ever seen a man fight so fearlessly in the face of gunfire, or even at all. As I yawn. His eyes glowed out from his blood-drenched face, and his arms never slowed.
おいお前たち、そろそろ敵兵の弾もつき始めたようだぜ。気合い入れ直せよ。
He took a moment to roar over his shoulder before turning back to the important task of killing guards. His fearless charge seemed to have had an effect.
この戦、もしかしたら勝てるんじゃねえか。
そうだ、勝てるかもしれねえぞ。新選組に土方さんに続け。
As their morale rose, so did their determination, and the fighting along the gate grew more intense. Then, just after the sun had passed its zenith,
開いた。城の大門が開いたぞ。
俺たちが勝ったのか。
the news spread along the line like wildfire.
思ったより手間取ったが、ま、予想通りだ。
副長の采配、お見事でしたよ。弾の嵐の中を突っ切っていく姿はまさに武士の鏡でした。
おだてたって何も出ねえよ。
Say,
それにまだ城が落ちたわけじゃねえ。気を引き締めてかからない。
oh. I paused as well. I paused as we all talked because the soldiers who'd been so reluctant to fight had now surrounded us, murmuring excitedly to one another.
土方さん、素晴らしい戦いぶりでした。まさに源義経が蘇ったかのようで、さすが新選組の副長です。
Yoshitsune Minamoto, a general from the late Heian period, he is best known for defeating the Taira clan at the Battle of Ichinotani and Yashima, then destroying them at the Battle of Danora. Oh god, more words I can't speak correctly. Danora. During the Genpei War.
我々はあなた方を誤解していました。申し訳ございません。離脱しようとしていた兵士を切ったのは我々を勝利に導くため、これ以上の脱退者を出さないためだったのですね。あなたの下で戦えることを誇りに思います。あなた方こそ本物の武士だ。
The curiosity and fear we'd seen on their faces when we first met was gone now, replaced with respect and adulation.
これは一体どういうことなんでしょう。
I'm confused as well, Shimada. Shimada also seemed to be in shock of the reception and didn't know what to make of it. Even Hijikata is put off. Now that the battle was over, Hijikata-san was looking a little ill, and his mood was souring with its health. Are you alright? He pushed himself so hard and during daylight hours that his body had likely reached its limit. Besides, he was almost bathing in all that blood. The bloodlust might start up at any moment. It seemed that only sheer force will keep him standing.
大丈夫に決まってんだろ。城を落とすまでは死ねねえさ。
He rubbed a fist across his face, wiping away sweat and blood at the same time, then turned back to the soldiers.
先方軍は俺に続け。日暮れ前には城に攻め入るぞ。
はい。
Dawn came and Hijikata-san led the advance guard in an attack on Utsunomiya Castle itself. Their previous cowardice now forgotten, his troops fell upon the castle's defenders with great vigor.
この調子だと大した苦労もなしに落とせちまいそうだ。
He looked at me with a slight grin just as Shimada appeared.
副長、伝令です。大広間の部隊が苦戦しているとのこと。
苦戦だと。
Why do I have a bad feeling about this one?
詳しいことは分かりませんが、俺が様子を見に行ってきましょうか。
いや、俺が行ってくる。ここは頼んだぞ。
はい、わかり。
Whoops. Hijikata-san, what should I do?
ついてこい。一人で戦場をうろちょろされて、流れ弾にでも当たられちゃ夢見も悪い。
Hi. So it was decided that I head to the banquet hall with Hijikata-san. Bad feeling! Very bad feeling. Even before we stepped into the banquet hall, I knew something was wrong. Inside, our men were dead on the floor, their bodies laid out like the spokes of a wheel. And at the hub of that wheel...
やれやれ、こんなところにまで来てやがった。薩長と幕府が戦をやってるってのに、優雅にご旅行か。鬼ってのはよっぽど暇らしいな。
Yep. The only two men still standing in the banquet hall weren't strangers. Also, where the fuck is Shiranui? They were Kazuma and Amagiri, the demons. Why are you here?
我々は薩摩藩の命で密書を届けに参りました。まさか戦に巻き込まれるとは思いませんでしたがね。しかもその後に君たちも居合わせていたとは。
つまり新政府の連中の使いっ走りをさせられてるって。鬼ってのは誇り高いんだな。
まさかこんなに早くお前と相まみえることができるとは思わなかったぞ。土方とや。
顔に向こう傷つけてもらったのがよっぽど嬉しかったのかな。そこまで喜んでもらえりゃ光栄だぜ。
おざけ。
Kazuma ground his teeth and drew the long sword slung at his hip. Tachi, a long sword wielded by samurai between the 10th and 16th centuries. Its curvature and length set it apart in utility to the katana, which it precedes by hundreds of years. It wasn't the sword he'd worn the last time we'd met. This one shone in a strange, distinguishing way? It was almost as if it simply generated its own light rather than reflecting what hid it. I found myself unable to look away.
お前を殺せばあの時の屈辱を晴らすことができる。天霧、お前は手を出す。この男は俺の獲物だ。お好きになさるがいい。
Amagiri sighed and gave a minuscule shrug. He padded to a corner and folded his arms in silence.
やれやれ、腕の一本でも切り落とされなきゃわかんねえみてえだな。
He leaped across the room at Kazuma like a bullet from a gun. Kazuma blocked Hijikata's strike calmly, and their blades rattled against one another. Then Kazuma pushed back, and Hijikata was thrown across the room. In the blink of an eye, he leapt after his opponent and whipped out his sword in a quick slash. I don't like where this is going, and I'm afraid. Hijikata-san brought up the Kanasada at the last moment, catching Kazuma's strike before it could hit him. Hijikata-san's sword began to shake. Kazuma's edged closer. He was right, though. Even with fury-enhanced speed and strength, Hijikata-san was slower than before, less focused. A cruel, arrogant grin spread across his face, filled with altogether too many teeth. Hijikata-san leaped backwards, but he wasn't fast enough. Kazuma's sword licked out. The glowing blade traced a brilliant red line across his chest, blood erupting and splattering to the floor. Hijikata dropped to his knees. The front of his shirt began to turn red, and drops of blood fell to the floor beneath him. But he'd be okay. He was a fury. Any moment now, the bleeding would stop. But it didn't. Agonizing seconds stretched on, and still blood flowed from Hijikata-san's chest. Oh! You know, I was curious to know what effects that sword would have on a fury, but now I know! Yorimitsu Minamoto, a Chinese general who had lived during the Heian period. He is the hero of several folktales, such as the defeat of the demon Shuten Doji at Oyama and the destruction of the Tsuchigumo. Shuten Doji, a demon who had lived during the Heian period, whose nefarious exploits enlisted fear into all who encountered him. He resided in Mount Oe in Kyoto. Seriously? Kazuma smirked, giving the impression that he figured his victory was a foregone conclusion. He looked down at Hijikata-san, who was on his knees. He gave a taunting laugh, but Kazuma's grin didn't even twitch. I'm sorry, Kazuma, I can't hear a fucking word you said.
全て無に帰したというのか。
Hijikata-san prodded experimentally at the wound on his chest, then climbed slowly to his feet. Why are you doing that, sir?
要するに切られなきゃいいだけだ。挫折になるのはそうしてた。
どこまでも減らず口を立てる。リーダー、その強がりがいつまで続くか確かめてやる。
The Demon Slayer blade flickered with blue-white light and almost seemed to shiver in concert with Kazuma's murderous intent. Suddenly, the air seemed thick and oppressive. It was an effort just to breathe, and when I looked at Kazuma, my skin began to crawl. The Demon Slayer dropped towards Hijikata-san. He dodged the Demon Slayer, albeit only barely, and brought his own sword up to strike back. But when the Kanasada arrived, Kazuma had simply disappeared. No, I realized he hadn't disappeared. He was simply moving too fast for the eyes to see. Hijikata seemed to be able to keep up, but the margin for error was slim and getting slimmer. Kazuma dodged Hijikata-san's attack with ease, and his reposit slammed into the other man's shoulder. Hijikata-san's shirt was torn away to display a fresh, ragged wound.
どうすれば俺を殺せるか必死に考えている。俺が見たいのはその顔で、どうやっても俺を殺せない。そのことを悟った時の絶望の表情を見せろ。
Blood poured from his wounds, but Hijikata-san brought up his sword in time to catch the Demon Slayer. But he'd lost too much blood and his body was beginning to weaken. Kazuma overpowered him and Hijikata was thrown back. Then, as if things hadn't gotten bad enough, the white had disappeared from Hijikata-san's hair.
そろそろ限界が近づいてきたか。羅刹から人間の姿に戻っているぞ。虫けら以下の脆弱で哀れな生き物にな。
Kazuma's maniacal laugh echoed throughout the room as he gloated over the nearly unconscious Hijikata-san.
さあ、泣け、わめけ、未練がましく命乞いをしてみせろ。今日にいた頃から我らの邪魔をし続けた忌々しい新選組の名もろとも貴様を葬り去ってやる。
Hijikata-san's head twitched. He lost so much blood. I was amazed he was conscious, let alone lucid. But as I watched, his hands dug into the floor mat like claws. It was almost like he was keeping himself up through sheer will.
さんと会えなくなっちまってから、俺一人で抱えるにゃ重くて仕方なかった荷物だけどよ。それでもてめえの時に葬られちまうと思うと虫唾が走るぜ。
Blood poured from his shoulder and his chest, but he struggled to stand. The sight of him was so powerful, it was so tragic, that I couldn't bear to watch. If he didn't stop, he would die. I had to do something. Stop, Hijikata-san. Hijikata-san, no! You're hurt badly if you use your fairy powers. His eyes flickered to me for a moment, and I could see that his mind was already made up. Then they were gone, and he glared at Kazuma.
てめえの命がどれだけ削られようとどうでもいいさ。ただここでこいつに殺されてやるわけにはいかねえ。今まで命かけて作り上げてきたのにこんな刀ごときにぶち壊されてたまるかよ。
その体で一体何ができるというのか。見苦しさここに極まれる。
Kazuma swung his sword again, almost lazily. Hijikata tried to lift up his kanasada in time to block, but his right hand refused to respond. Then Kazuma's sword slammed into his right shoulder. He let out a strangled scream as his arm twitched in pain, his sword trembling from his grasp. Hijikata-san's clothes were soaked in blood, and his skin was the color of paper. Only rage and pure willpower kept him upright. But even then, they were beginning to waver.
もう少し楽しませてもらえると思ったが、そろそろ別れの時のようだ。もう憎まれ口を叩く体力も残っていないか。
Hijikata-san's shoulders shuddered with each labored breath, but still he glared at Kazuma.
どうした？刀を取らんのか。武士の意地とやらはどこに行ったんだ。
Even though Hijikata-san struggled to draw breath, he mustered what little strength he had left in him and reached for his beloved sword. It surprised me that Hijikata-san could even stand, and he gritted his teeth angrily before facing Kazuma. The tip of the blade dipped and wavered, and blood poured from his wounds, but still he stood. Please, I begged, just stop. Don't die. Just looking at him was enough to make me want to scream. Kazuma lifted that cruel sword, slick with Hijikata-san's blood, and he smiled.
待ちわびたぞこの時を。俺に屈辱を与えた貴様をこの手で殺すことができる時をな。
Suddenly, an ear-splitting detonation tore through the building. The wood of the castle creaked and moaned. I could smell something burning.
この匂い、もしや。
Suddenly distracted, Kazuma flicked his gaze around the room, looking for the source of the interruption.
カズだ、あいつら退却するとき城に火を放ちやがったぞ。火に巻かれちゃかなわねえ。さっさと逃げようぜ。
The fire spread quickly, and in mere moments, the roar of it was deafening. Flames began to lick at the wall of the banquet hall. Black smoke poured into the room, rough and irritating at my throat. The flames leapt to the dry wood and paper of the door, then to the flammable mats covering the floor. Almost immediately, the room was plunged into nigh unbearable heat, but neither Hijikata-san nor Kazuma lowered their swords. Both men were waiting for a chance to strike. If either made even the smallest wrong move, he would be cut to ribbons by the other. Tension filled the air until it was as thick as the acrid smoke. With a crackling roar and the moan of tortured wood, a section of ceiling collapsed to the floor between them.
くそ、崩れ始めたか。これ以上ここにいると我が身も危うい。
He shoved the Demon Slayer back into its scabbard angrily, glaring across the flaming wreckage at Hijikata-san.
土方とやら、この場は預けて、 勝負はまたの機会としよう。次こそは貴様の息の根を止めてやるから、せいぜい楽しんでおくがいい。
With one last grotesque, inhuman-like smile, Kazuma disappeared. Hijikata, are you alright? I ran to him. His face was twisted in pain, and he collapsed to his knees on the floor. His skin looked like wax. Practically forgotten until now, Amagiri walked towards us from his corner, seemingly unconcerned with the flames around him.
今後、我々鬼の一族は倒幕勢力から手を引くつもりです。
そりゃどうしてだ。
我々は薩摩藩から受けた恩をもう十分返したと思っています。何よりそう遠くないうちに幕府は滅びます。我々が手を貸さずとも。
I saw a glimpse of a bitter smile coming out of Hijikata-san's lips.
そりゃ承知の上だ。
それでも沈みゆく船にこのまま乗り続けるつもりですか。君たちの作り上げたものを評価せず、最悪の形で裏切り、放り捨てたのが徳川幕府だというのに。
The truth of Amagiri's words drove a knife into Hijikata-san's heart, and I saw his face fall. He replied with a sad smile.
それでも武士ってのは殿様のために戦うもんだ。俺が守りてえのは今江戸で蟄居してる慶喜さんでも江戸城でも幕府のお偉いさんでもねえ。俺たちの心の中にある幕府、将軍を守るために生まれた新選組を守り抜きてんだ。
Water time.
しょうがねえ荷物だが、近藤さんが戻ってくる前になくしちまうわけにはいかねえのさ。
Amagiri had closed his eyes while Hijikata-san spoke. Now he stood silent for a moment. After a long moment, he reopened his eyes.
もし風間が今後、君は彼女に関わり続けるのであれば、彼は鬼としての仁義を失うことになる。一族の後ろ盾をなくし、はぐれ鬼となります。おそらくそう遠くない未来、君たちの前に姿を現すと思いますが、それは我々には関わりのないこと。彼のことは君たちに任せます。
Then Amagiri turned and disappeared. At last, Hijikata-san collapsed. Although from relief or simple exhaustion, I couldn't tell. Hijikata-san, are you okay? But he had passed out. No matter how much I shook him or cried his name, he refused to open his eyes. The fire had grown more intense, and I was beginning to sweat in earnest. If we didn't get out soon, we would both burn to death. But how could I move Hijikata-san? It was far too heavy for me to carry on my own. Shimada! From down the hall came Shimada's voice. Shimada! We're over here! Hijikata-san is Moments later, Shimada burst through the door, scattering sparks and burning fragments across the room. Damn!
副長、しっかりしてください。
He just passed out a minute ago. He's lost a lot of blood. If he doesn't get treated soon, he'll...
わかりました。俺が運んできます。君は俺の後ろをついてきてください。煙を絶対に吸わないようにして。
Without even waiting for my reply, Shimada hefted Hijikata-san onto his back and set off at a jog. Hey! Hijikata-san had risked his life to take down Utsunomiya Castle. In the end, it didn't matter. The castle Hijikata-san risked his life to take was retaken by the Imperial Army 4 days later, with nearly 20,000 men from the Satsuma, Choshu, Ogaki, and Totori domains. Ogaki domain, longtime allies of the shogunate who had served alongside them at the Battle of Toba Fushimi, before defecting at the last minute and spearheading the Imperial attack force. Totori domain, one of the traitorous domains who defected at the Satsuma Choshu side during the Battle of Fushimi. Following the battle, they marched alongside Imperial troops to capture Edo. After the battle, Otori and the rest of his soldiers set out to Aizu. Hijikata-san had miraculously survived his ordeal, but he was by no means recovered. He drifted in and out of consciousness for days, hovering at death's door. He was eventually sent away from the front to Nikko so he could recover. Since we'd arrived in Nikko, I'd busied myself doing my best to take care of him. As a Fury, most normal medication had little to no effect on him. Most of my nursing, therefore, consisted of fervently hoping that his natural strength and tenacity would bring him through. Fortunately, my prayers seemed to pay off, and in time his wounds began to heal. Although those made by Cosmos Demon Slayer did not do so easily or quickly. I found myself thinking about the Battle of Utsunomiya. After watching Hijikata-san in battle, the same soldiers who were too frightened to fight just minutes before ran to cross swords with the enemy. Afterward, they had told him that he was an honor to fight alongside the Shinsengumi. Told him that it was an honor to fight alongside the Shinsengumi, for they were true samurai. Hijikata-san, you are the core of the Shinsengumi. Without you, there is no Shinsengumi. The Shinsengumi needs you. So please, you can't die. Please. Several days later, I walked into Hijikata's room to change his bandages and was brought up short by what I saw. What did we see? Hijikata-san, what are you doing? He recovered some, enough to move and speak without pain, but he was still confined to his bed. Or at least he was supposed to be. This man knows no bounds! You can't do that! When I said you were healthy enough to get up, I didn't mean you were healthy enough to work! Please tell me we drag his ass to bed. You nearly died! You need to rest! Barely a scratch! Do you know how long I've been taking care of you? He continued to write, not even bothering to look up. I hoped for a little more contrition. However, it seemed like I needed to take what I could get. Well, at least let me put this on you. You're going to catch a chill. I feel like that should be cold, but okay. As I spoke, I draped his old jacket across his shoulders. I'm glad to see you understand how this works. Now, as soon as that's done, it's straight back to bed for you. And don't even think about working behind my back. I've got my eye on you. At last, Hijikata-san turned and looked at me. His face quirked in a small, bitter smile. He was more polite than I'd expected. Huh? Had I heard wrong? I stared back at him intently. Hijikata-san's thanks was rarely unaccompanied by Hijikata-san's thanks was rarely unaccompanied by cynism, sarcasm, or outright derision. But this... what had come over him? He was strangely genuine. No. It's not like that. It was more that I'd never seen Hijikata-san act so... nice. Later that night...
副長が意識を取り戻したって本当ですか?
That was quick!
土方君の怪我の調子が良くなったと聞いて寄らせてもらったよ。
I'm gonna remember, brain. Konbanwa, Otori-san, Shimada-san. Hijikata-san is over here. Before I could even finish, Shimada dashed past me to Hijikata-san's side.
よかった。あの時は本当にどうなることかと。
Oh, Shimada! Shimada's eyes began to tear up and he blinked rapidly to clear them.
大げさだな。あれっぽっちで死にゃしねえよ。
そうですよね。副長は何があっても絶対に死んだりしませんよね。
He rubbed his hand across his face awkwardly, trying to brush away the tears that refused to stop forming. Oh!
土方君、今日は言いたいことを言わせてもらうよ。宇都宮城での君の戦いぶりはまさに鬼神のごとしだった。士気も大いに上がり、兵士たちは皆君のことばかり噂しているよ。だが君の戦い方は参謀としては失格も失格、問題外だ。指揮官が最前線に出て行ってどうする？
ちょっと大鳥さん、怪我が治ったばかりなんですから、いきなりそんなことを言わなくても。
いや、言わせてくれ。今日ばかりは我慢できん。いいかい土方君、部隊の洋式化というのは兵に洋式の軍服を着せ銃を持たせればできるものではない。僕らは戦力と人員をきちんと把握し、どうすれば勝てるのか 戦術をきちんと考えなくてはいけない。闇雲に突っ込むだけでは昔と何も変わっていないんだよ。兵士を手足だとするならば参謀は頭脳だ。頭脳が死んでしまってはたとえ手足が残っていても戦争の遂行はできないんだ。
Hijikata-san's eyes went wide. Otori continued, oblivious, but I knew what Hijikata-san was thinking. Those words were exactly from...
何をしているんですか、副長。あなたは頭で、俺は手足のはずでしょう。そんな風に我を忘れて敵陣に突っ込んでどうするんですか。手足ならたとえなくなっても彼は効きます。ですが頭がなくなってしまっては何もかもおしまいです。
The day Hijikata-san had become a fury, Yamazaki said very nearly the same words to him.
なんか山崎にまた叱られてるみてえだな。
Might as well be. Oh, God! His words were to himself, and there was a faraway look in his eyes. Otori frowned in a confused manner.
土方君、何がおかしいんだい？僕は真面目に話してるんだよ。僕も僕の部下も君をどれだけ心配したことか。
For a few moments, he simply stared at Otori. Normally, he would have fired back with sarcasm or perhaps outright insults, but if he was in a bad enough mood. But this...
今日は何を言われても凄んでも意見を曲げるつもりはないからな。いや、
分かってるよ、鳥さん。迷惑かけちまってすまなかったな。
He followed his surprisingly genuine apology with a similarly surprising bow. Otori had clearly prepared himself for a variety of reactions for Hijikata-san, but this had apparently not been one of them. For several moments he simply stood there, too flabbergasted to speak.
島田もすまなかったな。俺をここまで運んできてくれたのはお前なんだろう。
いえ、副長のためでしたらあれくらい。
Shimada seemed just as confused as Otori by Hijikata-san's sudden change. I didn't understand it either, but there was no denying that something was starting to change within Hijikata-san. Oh boy, chapter 4! Am I ready? I don't know. Alright. The summer bloomed from the buds of spring. The battle between the waning fragments of the old shogun and the imperial army was moved to Aizu. Rumors about the intense fighting seemed to float in and out of our ears, and I grew uneasy thinking about the loss of lives on each side. Although he hadn't healed completely, Hijikata-san decided to leave Nikko as soon as he was well enough to march. The trip was long on foot, but without any problems. Eventually, we arrived at Shirakawa Castle, one of the main rally points for our troops. At last, we had caught up with the main body of the Shinsengumi. Saito was there to greet us the moment we arrived at the castle.
再び生きてお目にかかれたこと大変嬉しく思います、土方さん。
お前も無事で何よりだ。ずいぶん頑張ってくれたそうじゃねえか。
Although Saito looked relieved to have been reunited with Hijikata-san, Saito frowned and rubbed his hand at his forehead. And perhaps he was fatigued from the battles occurring one after the other.
相馬、野村、お前らも無事でよかった。心配したんだぜ。
Okay, wait, how did this happen? One, wasn't Soma arrested? And two, wasn't Nomura with Kondo-san? Hijikata-san voiced appreciation towards the two, but both Soma and Nomura had glum expressions. It was Nomura, actually, who began to shake before breaking down into tears. Oh no! Oh, here it comes. He bowed prostrate, his voice quivering violently.
俺は局長の恩義を任されていながら力及ばずお守りすることができませんでした。
Although we had heard what Nomura said, we couldn't get ourselves to grasp the meaning of his words. For him to be this distraught over being unable to protect Kondo must mean... Eventually, Saito continued after Nomura seemed inconsolable, and he took up where Nomura left off.
近藤局長は4月の末板橋の刑場にて斬首に処されたとのことです。
Beheaded. I swallowed. The kind-hearted Kondo-san. He hadn't even been given the chance to retain his honor and take his own life. He'd simply been beheaded like a common criminal. Such an act would have been pure humiliation for Kondo-san. Perhaps Hijikata-san had expected that.
そうか。近藤さんは腹も切らせてもらえなかったか。
His voice was controlled and unsurprised, but within his eyes I could see a bottomless, yearning despair.
局長をお守りできなかったのは俺の落ち度です。お願いします、副長。俺の首を晴れてください。
God, I want to hug Nomura.
俺もです。除名嘆願を買って出ながら局長をお助けすることができなかったんですから。
Nope, I want to hug both of these boys. Oh my god. Why do only one of you have a root?
バカなこと言ってんじゃねえ。これ以上大使を減らすような真似ができるはずねえだろ。死ぬ覚悟ができてるんだろ。薄っぺらい言葉なんぞじゃなく、戦場で示しやがれ。
The two fell silent. Both of them let Hijikata-san's words sink deeply into their minds, and eventually... You could hear the guilt drip from their voices. Oh my god. Later that night, I wasn't expecting that art. Oh my god. Heisuke and Sanon came to visit Hijikata-san. As members of the Fury Corps, they had been resting when we arrived in the afternoon.
今日はいつもより早く目が覚めましたよ。君が期待したおかげで場内が騒がしかったもので。
かなりの大怪我だったんだろう。こんなに早く合流できるなんて思わなかったぜ。
こう戦続きじゃいつまでも休んでられねえだろうな。
He sounded calm and relaxed enough, but I knew he wasn't that way on the inside. I'd felt depressed ever since we learned that Kondo-san passed away. However, I knew what I felt was nothing compared to what Hijikata-san must have felt.
ではそろそろおいとましましょうか。我々の仕事は夜半から始まりますので。
Heisuke nodded. They were halfway to the door when Hijikata-san spoke.
まあ、平助、悪いが斎藤を呼んできてくれるか。
はじめくん、わかった、呼んでくる。けど土方さん、ここに着いたばっかりなんだし、今夜ぐらいはゆっくり休んでくれよな。
He gave Hijikata-san a quick grin, then turned and left. With Heisuke and Sanon-san gone, the room fell into a somewhat awkward silence. Hijikata-san had told me to leave, but it seemed unlikely that he would start talking to me either. No. I'd opened my mouth to speak in a desperate attempt to break the silence. Then the door slid open, and Saito stepped in.
俺にご用だと伺いましたが、何か。
Without even waiting for him to sit, Hijikata-san began to speak.
斎藤、今後の戦いは俺が前線で指揮をと。
What? I gulped. That came out of nowhere. If we were to be fighting on the front line, the violence would be intense. Hijikata-san still hadn't fully healed. He was healthy enough to put himself in that... Was he healthy? Was he healthy enough to put himself in that kind of danger?
討ち死になさるおつもりですか。
みすみす殺されてやるつもりはねえよ。今まではお前が前線に出てたんだろう。副長の俺がその役目を肩代わりするのは当然だろうが。
The chief heading to the front line would raise morale. That was certain, but Hijikata-san was the core of the Shinsengumi. If he died, then the Shinsengumi would collapse.
そのお言葉には一理あると思います。ですが、俺の代わりを務めるとおっしゃるのであれば。
The air suddenly felt thick as Saito's hand fell to his sword.
俺を倒してから向かってください。俺より劣る腕前であれば、前線へ向かっても犬死にするだけですから。
Saito?
言うようになったじゃねえか。
His mouth twisted into a grin as his sword slid from its scabbard. Hijikata-san, not you too! Please stop this. You're friends. You shouldn't be fighting each other. Hijikata-san turned his eyes to me, and they were as cold as ice.
お前は口を挟むな。黙ってみて。
Hijikata-san. He wasn't going to listen to me, that much was clear. All I could do was be silent and watch. Seconds lingered as they remained unmoving. Then they both exploded into motion at the same time. Swords collided. They struggled for a moment, swords grinding until...
なんだと。
Hijikata-san was thrown back to sprawl across the floor. Even only partially healed, he still had far greater strength than a human, and he wasn't the sort of person who would have gone easy on Saito.
傷も癒えきらぬ状況で生き残れるほど、合図は甘い場所ではありません。
My hand is on my mouth! Saito! I literally slapped my hand across my mouth when I saw Saito. What? Saito. The red eyes, the white hair. There was no doubt that Saito-san was a fury. Did you drink the water of life?
気遣いは不要。これは俺自身が選択した結果だ。
I didn't know what to say. The simple fact that Saito-san had become a fury said more about the battles he'd been fighting than words ever could.
自ら激戦地で指揮を取りたいというお心は理解できているつもりです。だからこそ行かせるわけにはいかない。
There was a calm finality to Saito-san's voice as he slid his sword back into its scabbard.
戦いの最中に身を置いていれば苦しみを忘れられるかもしれない。しかし忘れてもらっては困ります。現実から目を背けるべき時ではありません。
Hijikata-san slowly put his own sword away, then stood silently, looking into Saito-san's eyes.
新選組の副長だからか。
近藤局長亡き今、新選組を滑る人だからです。
After hearing Saito-san's unwavering response, Hijikata-san sighed.
前線での戦いは俺たちに任せてください。土方さんは城にとどまって作戦の指揮を。
分かった。合図の前線指揮はお前に任せるよ。少なくとも俺の傷が癒えるまでは。
ありがとうございます。
He was honest when he thanked him. Then he turned to face me. はい。
土方さんを頼む。傷が癒えるまで目を離さないでくれ。
I nodded and gave Saito-san what I hoped was a reassuring smile. He inclined his head to me, turned to Hijikata-san to bow, and then left. I quietly let out a sigh of relief. As soon as he was gone, Hijikata-san's face darkened and his brows drooped together.
やれ。目付け役をつけなきゃならねえほど俺を信用できねえってこと。
He's just worried about you. That's all. I didn't really know how effective of a babysitter I could be, but Saito-san had put his trust in me. I had to at least give it my best shot. I know you're anxious to get back into battle, but you need to rest, alright? He gave a bitter laugh, then suddenly stopped. Yo, it's round 4 time. It is time for round 4. He clapped a hand to his stomach in pain. Hijikata-san. He started to shake, and his hair and eyes changed color. The bloodlust had taken hold of him, and he began to moan in pain. But if this continued, anyone could see him at any time. Hijikata-san, come into this room. I managed to carry Hijikata-san, writhing in pain, to the room next door. But what was I to do now? Give him blood. Hijikata-san. I moved towards him, and I saw in his eyes that he already understood. I tugged at my collar, loosening it like I'd done before. He bent toward me, and I felt a sharp pain in my neck. I stayed as still as I could. His hot breath panted across my neck, but as he drank it slowly, he began to calm. I felt relief wash over me. If I could take away even a little of his pain like this, then this was the right way to do it. Eventually, he pulled back. There was pain on his face, but not from the bloodlust. Hmm? His mouth twitched up into a sour half smile. Hijikata-san? His eyes were distant and he didn't even seem to hear me. I couldn't find the words to describe it, but something felt strange, wrong. A car went beep. 1868 September. Oh. By the time Hijikata-san's injuries had fully healed, it was nearly mid-August. Battles still raged across the Aizu domain, but the advantage was slowly moving to the Imperial Army. Our troops were being driven into a corner. Then one day, Shimada burst into the room, gasping for breath.
Otori-san からの伝令が届きました。曰く、仙台にて再起をかけると。
仙台藩というと、奥羽越列藩同盟の盟主とされる藩ですね。
Northern Alliance, the military and political coalition between the Mutsu, Dewa, and Echigo domains, formed with the intent of fighting against the Empire of Japan. It was led by the Sendai domain. In other words, they were all allies to the Aizu, as well as the troops loyal to the former shogunate. Unfortunately, it was only a matter of time before the Aizu men on the front lines fell to the Imperial Army.
合図がいつ落ちるかわからないこの状況でか。
だからこそ分散したまま兵力を削られるよりは一発逆転にかける方が勝ち目もある。大鳥さんも随分と派手なことを思いついたもんだ。
Excitement glittered in Hijikata-san's eyes. Apparently, he approved of Otori's plan. I hadn't seen Hijikata-san this excited in a while, and the others in the room picked up on this energy.
旧幕府海軍もすでに江戸を脱走し、海路にて北上しているとのことです。
では、私が先行して仙台に向かいましょう。本隊が到着するまでに地盤を固めておきますよ。
You? True, someone had to go first, at the very least to establish a base for the Shinsengumi. We'd also likely need to pay our respects to the leaders of the Northern Alliance. It just seems a little dangerous to have our representative be someone from the Fury Corps.
仙台は私のふるさとですから、つてがあります。内情を探るにしても、私が適任でしょう。少々気になることもありますしね。
Eh? Bothering you? He nodded and smiled, but it seemed that was all he'd tell me. What could be bothering him? I had a very bad feeling.
けど三男さん死んだことになってるだろう。今さら出て行っても混乱を招くんじゃねえか。
Yeah.
それくらいどうとでもごまかせますよ。
Eh?
そう言われますと、やはり三男さんが適任かもしれません。
羅刹は先行部隊には向かねえよ。昼間に移動できねえんだからな。
昼に活動するのは手間ですが、できないわけではありません。今は正念場ですからね。多少の無理なら喜んでさせていただきますよ。
What are you up to? I didn't doubt his ability to do what he said, but I did question the validity of his motives. I had a very bad feeling. Hijikata-san and Sanan-san stared at one another silently.
その伝令にはまだ続きがありましてね。大鳥さんは伝習隊を率いてボナリ峠に向かい、新政府軍の進軍を食い止めるつもりのようです。味方の兵を仙台に移動するため猶予を作るおつもりなのでしょう。
ボナリ峠って今の最前線だよな。大鳥って人の考えもわからなくはねえけど、時間稼ぎなんて言うほど簡単じゃねえだろ。
確かに今の新政府軍との戦力差を考えると。
大鳥さんたちに生還してもらうためにはボナリ峠に援軍を出す必要がある。
その案には賛成できません。我々が勝利をつかむためには無傷のまま仙台へたどり着く必要があります。
それはつまり会津藩、今まで我々を庇護してくださった会津公を見捨てるということですか。
ここで共倒れになってしまっては元も子もありませんよ。
I was told that the Shinsengumi owed much of their survival and their success to the Aizu domain. However, for Sanan to be victorious in Sendai, then the Shinsengumi would have to leave. All of us. It was not an easy decision to make. Hijikata was visibly disturbed at having to decide. However, it was Saito who shot a glance at everyone, seemingly having made up his mind on the matter.
俺が会津に残ります。
What?
上洛したばかりの頃、何のつてもなかった我々を預かり、後ろ盾となってくださったのは会津藩です。会津公の庇護なくして今の新選組はありませんでした。ですから俺は最後までここで戦いたい。ボナリ峠には俺が向かいます。土方さんたちはこのまま仙台へ向かってください。
斎藤、お前。
では私も出立の準備を整えましょう。善は急げと言いますからね。
Before giving Hijikata-san a chance to reply, he stood and left the room. Heisuke didn't seem particularly happy about how things had turned out, but after a moment of furious thought, he stood up as well.
俺も三男さんと一緒に行く。あの人から目を離すのは不安だしな。
そうしてくれると助かる。
Be careful, Heisuke.
大丈夫、任せとけって。
He gave me a smile and winked, and then dashed out the door after Sanan-san. Every time I see Heisuke, he just brings me joy. God!
伝令の準備をしておいてくれ。大鳥さんと会津藩に新選組の決定を伝える。
わかりました。早急に用意を整えます。
He bowed and left. Saito turned once again to face Hijikata-san. Whether or not he'd been waiting until the room emptied to do so, I wasn't sure.
土方さんは何としてでも生き残ってください。
どうした、やぶから棒に。
新選組
近藤さんや土方さんが信じて築き上げてきた武士の道そのものです。
Even when they were slandered and despised by the people of Kyoto, and when the shogunate began to capitulate to the imperial army, they had never bent, never compromised what they stood for.
新選組が掲げる誠の旗は今や侍たちの拠り所になっています。新選組は武士を導く者、義の道しるべです。
And every warrior's soul was honor, dedication, and loyalty. And the Shinsengumi, those values were made fresh. There could be no retreat. Saito and Hijikata-san looked at one another silently.
俺は新選組を作り上げた土方さんにこそ道しるべを担い続ける義務があると考えています。
簡単に言ってくれるじゃねえか。
Then, Hijikata-san gave his usual thin-lipped smile and spoke in a very peaceful manner.
お前に約束してやるよ。俺は新選組の行く末を見届ける。
Saito-san bowed.
ありがとうございます。
He looked up, and Saito-san eventually turned silently towards me.
土方さんを頼む。
So few words, but with such great emotion behind them. Ah, we'll be fine. I nodded. What do we say? He wouldn't die even if you killed him. After all, I don't think Hijikata-san could die even if someone killed him. Saito's eyes widened in surprise. I've seen him on the verge of death lots of times, but he always pulls through. Don't worry about him. He'll fight with the Shinsengumi forever. So, I set my jaw and looked Saito-san straight in the eye. Please don't die, Saito-san. The battle at Bonari Pass was sure to be an intense one. Many men would lose their lives. However, there is a tremendous difference between going into battle prepared to die and going into battle expecting to die.
殺しても死なねえとは随分な言い草じゃねえか。俺の心配をしてる暇があるなら、お前ももう少し自分のことを心配しろ。
He said it as a joke, but there was no mistaking the underlying sincerity. He went along with my statement after knowing my intentions.
俺も簡単には死ねません。掲げた新選組の名にかけて。
He turned his eyes to me. He gave me a peaceful gaze.
気遣いに感謝を。
I accompanied Hijikata-san to Sendai. Hijikata-san was still gravely concerned about Saito-san, so Hijikata-san ensured that Shimada would accompany Saito-san to Aizu. Perhaps the two of them would be able to overcome dangers that Saito-san would have been unable to alone. Leaving Saito-san and Shimada-san turned out to be much more difficult than I had imagined. I spent so much time with them. All I could do was pray that they would survive, and that we would meet each other again someday. (1868) October! This looks familiar. As September began, the cold autumn wind blew down on the main body of the Shinsengumi as they arrived in Sendai. The trip had been easy enough, but upon our arrival we encountered a new problem. Sun and the Fury Corps were nowhere to be found. Heisuke, too, was unheard from. We were genuinely concerned about it. But it became so stronger after we arrived in Sendai. From the villages in Sendai, we heard disturbing rumors that murder had been on the rise in recent days. We scarcely wanted to think about it, but... Body, are you done? Alright. We scarcely wanted to think about it, but it hardly seemed like it could be a coincidence. Upon reaching Sendai Castle, we were greeted by a man in Western garb. As soon as he laid eyes on Hijikata-san, his face split in a grin. Wait a minute. It can't be. Nope.
久しぶりじゃねえか、土方君。元気にしてたかい?
I was thinking of something else, but I have zero clue who you are, sir.
榎本さんも変わりない様子で何よりです。
Man has a mustache. Takei Enomoto, the second in command of the Shogunate Navy and captain of the flagship Kayomaru, leading the fleet to go to Ezo. He was later elected president of the Republic of Ezo. Later on, I learned this man was Takei Enomoto. He was the Shogunate Navy's second in command. When Edo had surrendered to the Imperial Army without a fight, he had taken his flagship, Kayomaru, captured 8 more battleships, and left. Kayomaru, the flagship of the Shogunate Army. When we left Osaka Castle for Edo, it was his suggestion to perform the funeral by the sea on behalf of Yamazaki. Oh. He'd taken his new fleet to Sendai and arrived before we had. Hijikata-san only nodded.
力になれなくてすまなかったな。惜しい人を亡くしたもんだぜ。
近藤さんも喜んでると思います。榎本さんほどの方にそう言ってもらえるなんて。あの人のためにも今後のことを考えましょう。仙台の状況がどうなってるのか教えてもらえますか。
そうだな。先に言っとくが、あんまり愉快な知らせじゃねえかもしれねえぜ。
Does that mean?
まず、仙台城の様子がおかしい。やっこさんたちの考えがさっぱり読めねえ。正式に会談を申し込んでも、是非の返答すらよこさねえ。さらに、仙台藩にはおかしな部隊がある。つう話まで広まり始めてるところだ。
Suspicious? How?
ああ。仙台では辻斬りが横行しててな。その犯人たちが城に戻るところを見た。なんて噂がまことしやかにささやかれてる。
Suspicious men running amok in Sendai? Possibly murdering civilians? Sunan and the Fury Corps unreachable. It wasn't difficult to put 2 and 2 together. Hijikata-san and I looked at one another. There was no doubt that we were thinking the same thing.
何にせよ、このままじゃ動きようがねえ。せめて辻斬りの犯人をとっ捕まえて治安維持に努めたいところだが。
榎本さん、その辻斬りの件、俺に預けてもらえねえか。
Enomoto opened his mouth to protest, but something in Hijikata-san's gaze made him change his mind and he nodded.
の辺は君に任せよう。詳しい事情は聞かねえことにしとくよ。
He bowed politely and he smiled and walked away. Enomoto was a kind, candid man. I had a feeling he was well liked by his men, and he seemed to get along well with Hijikata-san. I confess, I felt rather relieved. But not entirely, however. The dark cloud above our heads was merely lightened, not lifted. Do you think Sanan-san is the one killing people?
今の段階じゃ何とも言えねえな。だが確実に言えるのは、もしあの人が辻斬りの首謀者なら、三男さんを切るしかねえってことだけど。
土方さん。
羅刹の寿命について知ったとき、三男さんはかなり動揺してたからな。自暴自棄になっても不思議じゃねえ。
Oh. It certainly seemed like that Sanan-san was responsible for the murders. But all I could do in my position was hope beyond reasonable doubt that it wasn't true. If the truth turned out to be different, then I didn't doubt Hijikata-san would kill him without hesitation. Whether he wanted to or not.
今の仙台は微妙な状況に置かれてる。俺たちもうかつの行動はできねえ。お前も気を抜くんじゃねえぞ。
There were plenty of questions I wanted to ask him, but he had other things on his mind. It wasn't the time. The following day, Hijikata-san began his investigation. I tried to convince him that his body needed rest, not the stress of a murder investigation. However, I might as well have tried to lift a horse. That was how I found myself lounging around our rooms while Hijikata-san went off on rounds with the rest of the soldiers. I was so engaged when an unexpected visitor arrived. Hesuke? I was clearly thrown off by my sudden guest. Where were you all this time? We couldn't get a hold of you. We were all so worried. He didn't answer my questions, but rather he jumped straight to the chase.
千鶴、土方さんがどこにいるか知らねえか。
He's off doing rounds at the castle.
そっか。じゃあ伝言頼めるか。俺たちが仙台に着いてからのこと全部話すから土方さんに伝えてくれ。
All right. I gulped, waiting for him to open up. Oh God, what are we faced with? Because Heisuke and that face equals serious mood, and I am afraid.
仙台藩が俺たちに協力してくれなくてさ。もしかしたら新政府軍の方から圧力をかけられてるんじゃねえかって三男さんが言ってて。仙台藩の内情を探ってるうちに高堂さんがここに来てることを突き止めたんだ。
You know, I was wondering where this thread went. What? My father had been forced to do research on the Furies by the rebels before war broke out, or at least that's what we thought. But now he was here? In Sendai?
しかも高堂さんは新政府の羅刹隊を率いてるみたいでさ。
Oh.
放っておくわけにはいかねえから敵方の動きを監視してたんだけど。
And?
見ちまったんだ俺。三男さんが高堂さんと密会してるところ。
What? Heisuke explained that Sanan-san had told him they'd be more likely to get spotted if they moved together and went off on his own. This was pretty peculiar on its own, but sometime after they split up, Heisuke witnessed Sanan-san meeting with my father.
俺もうわからねえよ。三男さんが何を考えてるのか。
But it doesn't mean that Sanan-san is connected with the Imperial Army, right? I mean, maybe he was just performing some espionage to get information from Kodo?
それなら俺に嘘を言う必要はねえはずだろ。それに一度や二度じゃねえんだよ。何度もコードーさんと会ってやり取りしてるみたいでさ。土方さんに連絡を入れようともしねえし、俺どうしたらいいのかわからなくなって。土方さんが仙台に着いたって聞いたから、三男さんの目を盗んで抜け出してきたんだ。
That must have been hard on you. I just let my eyes fall to the floor. I wasn't sure what else to say. Then I heard a lot of commotion towards the entrance. A few moments later, the sliding door was kicked open and several strange men suddenly leapt into the room. Uh-oh!
なんだこいつら。まさか。
Without saying a word, the men had their gleaming sword at the ready, and they lunged for Heisuke.
おった。
He dodged the attack easily, drawing his own sword as he moved. With a snarl, Heisuke struck out at one of the men before he had a chance to recover. The spot where Heisuke had struck him was beginning to heal itself immediately. Furies?
千鶴、俺の後ろに隠れろ。
But then, just as I turned,
逃げる必要などないとも。
Really? Here? Now? At this moment? I felt my eyelids flutter incredulously after hearing the man's voice. The voice was familiar. Very familiar. Father? What could be going on? Why is Father here? Heisuke continued to duel with the Furies as I stood there in confusion.
くそ、なんだよこいつら。昼間だってのにどうしてこんなに動けるんだ。
Although he was clearly their superior in regards to swordsmanship, he was outnumbered and the daylight had weakened him. He was slow and his strikes were unsure. What is going on here? Father maintained his cool air of composure, and he muttered under his breath while observing the events.
素晴らしいだろう。彼らは日の光を克服した羅刹たちだよ。
Wait, Father, these Furies are your doing?
その通りだよ、千鶴。もしかすると誰かから聞かされているかもしれんが、私はずっと新政府軍にとらわれ、落ち水の研究を続けていたんだ。
Father, please stop them. At this rate, Heisuke will... His eyes widened as if he'd only just remembered, and he looked over to Heisuke with a smile.
彼には礼を言っておかねばなるまいな。彼のおかげでお前の居場所が分かったのだから。
俺を尾行してきたのか。
Heisuke spat out through gritted teeth. My father ignored him and turned back to me. His voice was soft.
今日はお前を迎えに来たのだよ。これでようやく我々の一族を再興できる。
clan? You mean the Yukimura?
この羅刹たちがいれば一族の栄華を取り戻すなど簡単なことだ。この成果を見れば新政府も我々を軽く扱うことなどできまい。我々を見捨てた古い鬼の一族を一掃することだって夢ではないはずだよ。
You're planning to use Furies to restore the Yukimura lineage to power?
そうとも。これは皆お前のためなんだよ。
I stood stunned for a moment. His voice evoked the same tone he used to speak with me when I was a child. I shook my head. I can't go with you, Father. There is no glory in bloodshed. The smile faded from Father's eyes. Instead, he walked closer. I tried to back away, but there were Furies blocking my way.
新選組に長くいすぎたか。人間どもに毒されてしまっているようだな。
What? No! I hadn't changed. It was Father who did.
さっとけよお前ら。
Despite being out of breath, Heisuke managed to swipe at the Furies with his sword, giving himself space. However, no matter how many strikes he could inflict, their wounds were healed immediately. More and more Furies arrived to the scene, and before we knew it, we were completely surrounded. Father.
もう少し腰を据えてじっくり話せばお前も分かってくれるだろう。
He then drove his fist forcefully into my stomach. Stars leapt up before my eyes, the world went dim, and I slipped into unconsciousness. Holy shit. When I awoke, I was in a room I didn't recognize. Where am I? I was in a daze as I muttered to myself.
ここは仙台城ですよ。
I heard a familiar voice coming from behind, and I shut up. Don't tell me it's... Son? This music is freaking me out. It literally sounds like the call of death. I'm gonna tell you that. That's what this music sounds like. Next to him was my father, whom I could only assume had carried me to this location. What's going on? Why are you two together?
高堂さんとは羅刹の研究を行うため協力関係を結んだのですよ。
Then, you're working with the Imperial Army now? You've betrayed the Shinsengumi?
さあ、それはどうでしょうね。
He gave me a teasing smile. We called for this, Sprite. Hopefully it's there. This is what the music makes me feel right now. This is how I feel over current situation. I don't like it. Explaining himself never seemed to interest him.
千鶴、体は大丈夫か？すまなかったね。加減はしたつもりだったんだが。
I don't like either of you. His tone was intimate and caring, a callback to the father I used to know, and I felt myself wavering. I couldn't, under any circumstances, let my guard down.
逃げようとは思わない方がいいですよ。私たちも手荒な真似はしたくありませんから。
So long as San and my father were in the room, escape was hopeless.
それにしても、彼女を連れてきたのは早計でしたね。土方君は勘がいいですから、彼女がいなくなったことで我々の計略を察してしまったかもしれない。
娘の居場所を知りたいなら東堂君を尾行しろと言ったのは君だろう。
東堂君を泳がせろとは言いましたが、彼女を連れ去れとは言っていませんよ。まあ、何にせよ済んでしまったことです。過去を悔いるより今後の策を練るべきでしょうね。
それならば心配いらんと。羅刹隊が東堂君を始末した頃合いだ。そろそろ仙台城まで戻ってくるだろう。
What did they do to Heisuke?
気の毒だが、もう生きてはおるまい。あの数の羅刹に囲まれたのだからな。
My whole body shook. No way Heisuke could have died. I wanted so badly to believe it, but the furies my father had brought didn't seem to have any trouble in sunlight. Heisuke, on the other hand, had looked pale and weakened.
誰が死んじまったって？勝手に決めつけんのはやめてくれねえか
？It's fine! Heisuke's fine! Heisuke! All of a sudden, Heisuke burst into the room. He wasn't alone either, because behind him was...
無事か、雪村。
He spared me a quick, concerned glance, then his eyes flicked back to Sanan-san and Kodo. I'm fine! I nodded vigorously, and Hijikata-san let out a short snort of laughter.
なぜお前たちがここに？
Hold on. The boys are here! Oh my god.
まさか改良を重ねた私の羅刹隊がただの羅刹に破られたというのか。
改良がただかなんだか知らねえがな。俺たちを仕留めてえならあの10倍でも足りねえくらいだよ。
そろそろ来る頃だと思っていました。他の大使は連れてこなかったんですね。まあ、君ならそうすると思っていましたが、2人だけで敵地に乗り込むなど無謀だとは思いませんでしたか。
状況を説明してもらおう。なぜ俺たちへの連絡を絶った？
仙台に君が求めるものはありません。奥羽越列藩同盟は戦争の回避を目論んでいます。
What? The Sendai domain, the leader of the alliance, was trying to avoid the war. It hit almost like a physical blow.
合図での度重なる敗北を伝えられ、腰が引けてきたようです。
私は新政府軍より密命を受けて仙台に来た。羅刹隊を率いて仙台城を落とし、同盟を完全に崩壊させろとの指示。しかしそれは私の本意ではない。新政府側の考えにはどうしても同意できん。
So Sendai was already preparing to retreat, which meant there was no need to attack Sendai Castle. All they needed was some pressure.
新政府軍に不満を持っていた高道さんと手を結び、私たちはこうして仙台を掌握するに至りました。
In return for not planning a direct strike on the castle, Kodo was given tacit consent to remain behind in the domain. This, of course, gave him time to develop more furies. Father, you're working with the shogunate's old allies?
私はお前の味方だよ、千鶴。人間たちの争いに手を貸すつもりはない。我ら一族を滅ぼした人間や我々を見捨てた古き鬼どもに復讐しよう。私たちの手で鬼の王国を作り上げる。いや、我々こそが新たな鬼の一族となるのだよ。
Father, I remember Sen describing our history to me. The village of Yukimura was destroyed by humans. If that were true, then I would understand why Father would resent humans, but even then, I couldn't get myself to agree with Father. Just then, the sound of footsteps loudly entered our ears, followed by shadows bringing sight to the sound.
彼らも侵入者に気づいたようですね。
こいつらは新選組の。
そうです。この城には新政府軍の羅刹だけではなく、我々新選組の羅刹隊も滞在させていました。
Not only would we have to confront our own furies, now we had to deal with Father's far more dangerous, much improved furies as well. They had us surrounded.
この国に存在する羅刹が今ここに集結しているのですよ。西洋式の軍備を持つ新政府軍だろうと確実に倒せるだけの最終兵器になります。
Red eyes surrounded us. But in their eyes I only saw madness, the mindless hunger and lust for blood of an animal starved too long. There was no humanity there.
さあ、手を貸しておくれ、千鶴。我々の旗頭にはお前が必要なのだよ。この羅刹たちを使い、雪村一族を再興しよう。
Father, I didn't care about restoring the Yukimura clan. I didn't want to create more furies so that blood could drive them mad. I didn't want to see more suffering. Father, you're wrong. His eyes went wide. Building a kingdom on the corpses of others isn't right. I can't agree to it. Human or demon, every life is precious. Just because our home village was destroyed doesn't mean we could oppress humans.
新選組に手を貸してもいいと高道さんはおっしゃってくれています。どうです土方君。この羅刹たちを率いて共に新政府軍と戦うつもりはありませんか。
俺の答えは花から決まってるさ。
Hijikata-san was opposed to the Furies from the beginning. He never approved of Sana-san's research into them after my father's disappearance. I doubted he changed his mind about them.
交渉決裂ですか。では仕方ありませんね。
Sanan-san sighed. He drew his sword slowly from its scabbard. Sanan-san. Did he mean to attack his own friend? I stiffened, but Hijikata-san didn't move toward his own blade. He remained still, coolly contemplating Sanan-san. Almost as if someone had dumped paint on it, Sanan-san's hair slowly changed to white. He raised his sword. A single cut and the fury was dead.
戦うことしかできない私たち羅刹に戦いの場も残されていないというのなら、ここで終わりにしてあげるのがせめてもの情けというものでしょう。
What? The room fell silent. Then it exploded in noise. The enraged battle cries of the Furies, the click and rattle of swords being drawn.
分かってるって。
Heisuke dropped into a fighting stance and slipped his hand around the hilt of his sword.
三男さん、ちょっと格好つけすぎだぜ。なんで俺らに言ってくれなかったんだよ。
Heisuke!
月並みな言葉ですが、敵を騙すにはまず味方から。
Their faces split into grins as their swords whistled and sparked, fury after fury falling before them.
それに新選組でこういった役目を引き受けるのは常に私でしたからね。
God damn it, Sanan! Ichikata-san's responds with a bark of laughter, I don't know, and drew his own sword in a flash of silver light as his hair turned white as well. The men got into their stances and faced the Furies as Furies themselves.
後始末は俺の役目って決まってるだろうが。
As their three swords spun and hissed through the air, blood gushed and splattered, painting the walls of Sendai Castle a deep red. They were like three gods of death. Wave after wave conquered, they drowned their foes in a sea of blood. I noticed that my mouth had gone dry, and my hands had begun to shake. I couldn't move. I saw Father sitting down at the corner. He seemed deflated.
偽りだったのか。王国で羅刹のさらなる研究を進めよう。三男君、君は確かにそう言ったはずだ。
Sanan-san looked over at him, sword in hand, splattered with blood.
先が見えてしまったんですよ。私は羅刹を生かす道を探っていました。先が短いと知ってからは特に焦りましたと。研究を推し進めるため、時には自らの手も汚しましたが。
He frowned, disappointed in himself. Every suspicious thing he had done had been in service of a single goal, saving his fellow Furies.
羅刹には未来がありません。コードさんも分かっているでしょう。たとえ日の光の下で動けるようになっても、力を使えば寿命は削られ、血に狂う衝動も消えてはくれない。
Sanan-san had confirmed the truth we'd all suspected. There was no way to save the Furies.
私たちは時代のあだ花なんですよ。羅刹は生み出されてはならないものでした。もう終わりにしましょう。
Sanan-san's true intentions had left me surprised. as had his admission that the Furies were a failure. Was he right? Could they never be saved? Had all hope been lost? I let my mind drift for just a moment, and then I saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. Suddenly there was a Fury only feet from me, his eyes red, mad with bloodlust. I reached for my sword. I was a little too late. Before my hand had even touched the hilt of my sword, I saw the Fury's blade sweeping towards me. There was blood, but it wasn't mine. No cuts on my body. Someone had protected me. It was Father. Father? I reached for him as he fell. The Fury pulled back for another swing, one that would likely be the end of both of us. Then it froze, gurgling oddly, and slid neatly in half, a blade glistening in the center.
何よそ見してやがるんだ。てめえらの相手は俺たちだろ。
He shifted his eyes up to my father's wound, and I saw his face twitch. Immediately he moved closer and turned his back to us, sword held at the ready.
しずる、大丈夫か。どこも怪我はしていないか。
There was blood splattered across his chest. It was an effort for him to speak. The wound he'd taken was undoubtedly a fatal one. I wanted to scream, but I tried to force a smile to my face. I'm fine. I'm not hurt at all. Despite my best efforts, my voice shook and cracked. He looked so peaceful.
羅刹の研究は失敗なのだよ。未来がないことぐらい本当は私も分かっていた。
Father.
どうしても諦められなかったんだ。一族を、お前の家を復興させたかった。
Ever since I'd been young, my father had always tried to do what was best for me. Even now, in his own way, he was still trying.
私は羅刹と共に消えゆく運命なのだろう。大きな罪を生み出したのだからね。
His voice was getting weaker.
これでよかったんだよ。だから泣かないでくれ、しずる。
I said nothing. I only nodded. Were I to open my mouth and speak, then the tears would never stop. I gritted my teeth. He gave me one last smile, sighed a calm breath, and he was gone. After what seemed like an eternity, I looked up. The battle was over. The Furies that came to fruition by the Shinsengumi and my father, except for Heisuke, Sanan-san, and Hijikata-san, not a single Fury was left alive.
少し惜しかった気もしますね。これだけの数なら利用価値もあったでしょう。新選組は多大な兵力を失ってしまいましたね。今後の戦いは勝ち抜けると思いますか？
Sanan-san's mouth tightened in concern, But Hijikata-san replied with a smile.
花から負けるつもりで戦うやつはいねえよ。
土方さんは負けず嫌いだからな。
Heisuke snorted with laughter, then coughed to cover it up. It was true. The Shinsengumi lost a lot of Furies, but their unity had grown stronger. That was something at least. Or so I wanted to think. A sudden burst of pain wiped the grin from Heisuke's face. Sana-san, too, had doubled over in agony. Was it the bloodlust?
限界が来たようですね。
You know, oh God! His voice was oddly calm, almost distinct. Limit? Amakiri's word had suddenly flashed through my memory. The Fury's power isn't a gift from the gods. You're only just borrowing your life that you would spend decades on. Heisuke saw my eyes go wide and gave me an awkward sort of laugh. He was right. They'd been in more battles as Furies than anyone else, and all of the strength and healing they'd enjoyed ate away at their futures until there was nothing left. Hijikata-san whispered. Sana-san smiled and then gave a slow nod.
自分の体ですからね。
His legs suddenly shook violently, and they fell to the floor. Hijikata dropped to his knees and took both of their hands in his own.
覚えていますか、土方君。まだ司令官にいた頃、幾度となく夜を徹して話し合ったこと。
近藤さんはこんな小さな道場の道場主で終わる器じゃねえ。世が世なら武将にも大名にもなってた人だってな。
まさか我々より先に近藤さんが行ってしまうとは思いませんでしたがね。君とは反目することもありましたが、君なしで新選組を作り上げることはできませんでした。
Sanan-san's voice was growing quiet.
そりゃあんたも同じだろう。
Hijikata-san responded, and I could tell the words were difficult to draw.
ことあるごとに芹沢さんに食ってかかってた俺をいさめてくれたのはあんたじゃねえか。
Hijikata-san was doing his best to act tough, so that Heisuke and Sanan-san wouldn't worry. But it wasn't easy for him.
俺らは先に行くけどさ、土方さんはもう少しのんびりしててもいいぜ。新選組ができてからろくに休んだこともなかっただろう。
Heisuke said in a bright and kind tone. Hijikata-san just nodded.
まあ無理かもしれねえけどな。土方さんって短気だし。
生意気なこと言ってんじゃねえよ。お前に心配されるほど落ちぶれちゃいね
Heisuke's face relaxed as Hijikata-san snarled back at him. Even in this moment, Heisuke was tender and kind for the benefit of Hijikata-san.
君の進む道は北にあります。
Sana-san could barely speak now.
幸田さんは落ち水の効果を薄めるとき、陸奥の水を使ったのだと聞きました。
Then, perhaps there was still hope. Maybe, just maybe, there's a chance something up north could repair the curse of the Fury to these men. Sanan-san's last words were the faint muster of hope for the fate of the Furies.
見失うなよ。
His voice had grown rough and raspy. I saw Hijikata's knuckles whitened as they tightened. But with a sound like sand pouring over stone, their hands crumbled to ash. In moments, they were no more. Hijikata-san. He didn't answer. He only stared, silent, at the twin piles of ash that sat where his friends were only moments before. I felt somehow that he was crying. There were no tears in his eyes, of course, but even so, somehow he was crying. I didn't know how long we sat there before he stood up. The room that included only us was devastatingly quiet.
帰るぞ。
Hi. His voice was curt and clipped, but when he turned to look at me, his eyes went suddenly wide.
泣くんじゃねえよ。
I nodded and tried to stop, but it was no good. The tears wouldn't stop no matter how much I wiped. In one day, in 1 hour, I'd been forced to say goodbye to Heisuke, to Sanan-san, and the father I hadn't seen in over a year. I can't. I can't. I can't. Don't give me this music game! No, I can't. I can't. I can't. I can't. I can't. I can't. Heisuke Sanan. I can't. No. I can't. Why is this room making me cry twice? Why? Oh god, it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. I quit for today. I quit with this game for today. We're gonna be back with it tomorrow, though. Probably finishing it. And, you know whose route we're gonna start after that? Going back to Kyoto Winds? Sanan! It's Sanan. I don't know how that one's going to go. But that doesn't mean we're over with the streams for today. 8 p.m. EST, we are coming back to do more Splatfest on Team Courage, while I have the mini bow, and I will probably be accompanied by some of my clan members as well. And we're doing challenges, so we can only use splatanas or bows. And then after 2 hours, we'll be going back into art stream mode, and we'll be completing full art for my characters from Ties of Fates. So, I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.